No.
Welcome all to the Equal Recycling Access panel. I'm Shannon Bouton. I'm the Global Executive Director for Sustainable Communities at McKinsey.org, which is a nonprofit. I lead our program that is currently operating in Indonesia and Argentina to build municipal infrastructure, train workers, and provide education for residents to ensure equal and inclusive access for all. And that's one of the reasons why I'm particularly excited to be moderating this panel on equal recycling access. We all know that recycling rates across the United States are not equal, and that's largely due to unequal access, infrastructure, and education. We can't expect people to recycle if the communities they live in don't have tools or systems to support recycling habits. Today, during our Equal Recycling Access session, we're going to discuss equity and recycling, and where are there opportunities, where are challenges, and where can we all do a better job in supporting a community-based circular economy? I'm delighted to welcome three esteemed colleagues in community action for recycling. Keysha Burton is the community program coordinator for the Recycling Partnership. And we're joined today also by Kristyn Oldendorf from Baltimore City's Department of Waste Reduction and Operations. She's the coordinator there. And Jennifer Ronk, Dow Sustainability and Advocacy Manager within Packaging and Specialty Plastics. Welcome all to this female-dominated panel. It's exciting to see so many female faces. I'm going to ask a question, but I do also encourage you all to add your questions in the chat, and I will try and incorporate them in as we go along. So to kick us off, Keysha, I'm going to turn to you. There are a lot of exciting stories about cities like San Francisco and Seattle achieving recycling rates upwards of 70%. But if we look closer at the data, we understand that these cities are in fact outliers. Many urban communities, especially lower income socioeconomic groups and in neighborhoods, and much of rural America does not have access to any recycling infrastructure or services. What is the reality of local recycling in the United States and across US cities?
So since the start of the Recycling Partnership 6 years ago, we felt empowered, we felt committed to empower and enable recycling systems at the community level. But we also understand that before we can ask people to recycle and to recycle well, we need to guarantee that they have the ability to do so. And that's just not the case that we're seeing, right? Through our research, we understand that the reality is only half of the US population has access to curbside recycling. And so that means half of the recyclables in households that have recycling service are only half of those materials are recycled. So in order for us to capture more material from the stream and quality recyclables, we have to support our residents through education that meets them where they're at, that meets their needs, right? We also understand that disadvantaged populations have unequal access. And today it is very fair to say that the recycling system and access to recycling is disadvantaged across certain streets, neighborhoods, and housing types across the socioeconomic lines. So that essentially results in limited or lack of participation within those communities. And this essentially means that if they're not participating, we're losing out on the benefits to the US system, both economically and environmentally.
So can I maybe ask just a quick clarifying question? When you say some streets have access and other streets don't, what is it that drives that? Do you know what the underlying cause of that is?
So I don't necessarily know what the underlying cause would be, but what I could say is that for communities that are disadvantaged, they have to meet certain foundational needs first, right? So if they're looking at their basic needs for housing and for food and for resources, they don't necessarily feel incentivized to participate in recycling services. And that limits their participation, that limits their access. So even though they have access, they don't have the basic core of what they need for life in order to participate in recycling services.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So Kristyn, I'm going to turn to you. In recent years, there's been a lot of public attention on issues around waste in the ocean, and there is a tendency to focus on emerging markets as the real problem, places like Southeast Asia for burning and dumping their waste. But what we see is that these practices are not uncommon even in the United States. So in your experience in Baltimore, you recently completed a long-term operational plan for solid waste that underscores the importance of recycling and its connection to a healthy environment. Can you share some of the important takeaways from that study and that plan?
Yes, thank you. So yes, Baltimore, our Department of Public Works, which I'm a part of, recently released a long-term operational plan, and this was titled Less Waste, Better Baltimore. And it was a really comprehensive planning process, and there were a lot of studies involved with this, waste composition studies, benchmarking study, looking at the current system and all the options for improving diversion, managing what's left. We had a lot of public input with this process as well, several public meetings and an online survey. And it showed that recycling is such a key component to reaching the maximum diversion potential that we know we can reach. And I found it was really interesting in this public input process, there was so much support for recycling. We do provide recycling citywide for every household, but there's support to grow that program even more. For example, in the online, 84% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that the city should increase access to curbside recycling. And indeed, one of the final recommendations of this plan was to provide free recycling carts to improve this participation in recycling. And if anyone's interested in learning more or looking more in depth at all the numbers, all the documents associated with this plan are on the DPW website. And I found it really encouraging to see so much support for recycling and improvements to our current system. And it kind of also underscored that that collection component is so key. Hold your recycling and collect it. That kind of gets to what you were saying about the attention on emerging markets with dumping and uncontrolled plastics contributing to marine litter. That's not unique. It's a challenge in Baltimore. Like in many US cities, we experience illegal dumping problems. Almost every day I see plastic bottles or other items in the gutters. And unfortunately, in Baltimore, the stormwater drains lead directly into the harbor. So unfortunately, those pieces of litter, when it rains, they end up in the storm drains and discharge into the harbor, which leads to the bay and so on. So that collection piece is so important to keeping those materials out of the waterways and getting them to where they should be going, which, in the case of a plastic bottle would be a recycling facility. So while we do provide recycling to every household, the service is there. I think simply providing a service isn't always enough. Sometimes you have to take that extra step, meet people where they are, explain what the program is, why it's important, how to use it, what's accepted. And I think if you can achieve that, it kind of is an effect of achieving a lot of things along with it. So yeah, and we did recently receive a grant from the Recycling Partnership for an anti-contamination campaign, kind of a campaign about recycling. So we think that will go a long way toward improving the program. So we know we actually are facing some challenges right now with collection due to the COVID-19 pandemic and having staffing challenges with our crews. But we know that we'll get stronger despite of that, especially with the support of our partners on this call and many other important stakeholders and partners we've been working with. So we're excited to move forward on those plans.
Great, thank you, Kristyn. So Jen, as we think about waste in the environment, there is clearly a lot of focus on consumer packaged goods players and the final destination of their packaging. Obviously, Dow is the origin of many of the plastics that go into that packaging. Where do you see the role in influencing the recycling environment, and what kinds of programs are you sponsoring and why?
So, we think we all have a part to play. That's why we like working with the Recycling Partnership. And what our response is different in different parts of the world. So, for example, we're founding members of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And a big thrust of those activities are to, try to bring infrastructure and resources to developing parts of the world. But as you alluded to earlier in the conversation, that doesn't mean that the work is done here. And so there's important work that we're doing with the Recycling Partnership and others. Some of it's to make sure that people more clearly understand what is recyclable and what isn't and where should it go. And some of it is just making sure that more people have access. Things like having lidded carts can be an important part of keeping material out of the environment. I used to live in a city where I had the little tote bins, and I was a very good recycler, so I always had a lot of material in there. But I was always kind of watching to see when the recycling truck was going to go through and then run out, because if I just put my recycling out the night before, it was all going to blow down the alleyway, and that's a terrible thing. So it's been really great to work with the Recycling Partnership on projects like the one that we're doing in Milwaukee, where some people in the community had lidded bins and some people in the community had tote bins, and there might have even been parts of the community where there weren't anything. And when things got collected, sometimes it was every week, sometimes it was every 2 weeks, sometimes it was every 3 weeks. And if we can bring more access and more consistency, along with the great education work that the Recycling Partnership does, to that community, I think we can get more better quality material. And that's the kind of thing that we're hoping to be able to do with Baltimore too, is just help them get more plastics back and participating in the circular economy.
Great. Thank you.
So,
so there are a lot of really interesting questions here about how to talk to communities that might not have access to there is one question from George Holmes that says, I see a large justified lack of trust between communities, governments, and corporations. Do you all believe involving communities in the decision-making process of these communities will enable a bit more trust between community members and the larger entities in order for them to accept these new practices in the communities? Keysha, I might start with you, but I'd be happy to hear from Jen or Kristyn as well on this one.
So I do believe it's important to engage your community in the conversation. It's the community that you're serving for recycling services. And often if you are engaged with them, they can give you good feedback on how to reach their neighbors and the surrounding community that will stimulate participation. So it's very key to get their buy-in. If you've ever been through a process for getting a MRF into a community, you need the community engagement, you need the community buy-in. And so you can't necessarily separate the two components.
Any other comments there?
Yeah, I would just absolutely agree with that. We always try to communicate with our community groups and residents and get their buy-in and feedback. It really is very key. And a lot of times they think of things, we haven't. Government represents its citizens, so we need to work together, especially when making major changes.
I would just add from our programs at Rethinking Recycling that we see that one of the things that we do is a lot of community developed communication about the recycling program. So we do a lot of focus groups and a lot of conversations with people to figure out what is it that incentivizes this particular community to do the work. So in one of the informal settlements that we work in Buenos Aires, we found that in particular, mothers were particularly concerned about their children playing in trash that was out in the street. So a lot of our communication about recycling focuses on that, about a cleaner environment, a healthier environment for parents to allow their children to play in the street. So I do think it is a very important conversation that needs to happen. There's another interesting, yeah, go ahead, Jen.
And I was just going to say that I'm frequently surprised at how involved communities can get. I mean, we believe in partnership. It's why we're working with these. We know we can't solve it alone. But man, there have been times when I've been involved in like public meetings to talk about a new recycling program, and I've thought, well, okay, I'll show up, but there's going to be 3 people that are here, and it will be standing room only. People want to know how they can be part of the process, and I think that that's really exciting.
There's another really interesting question here about successful transitions from free trash, pay for recycling and composting, to free recycling, composting, pay for trash, etc. So which of the streams do you pay people to actually collect and properly manage? And I would actually add also, have you seen any successful situations where you've paid people in the past, for example, bottle deposit laws, and what happens when you take those away? Can you actually embed the behavior with the payments system and then remove the payment system afterwards if it seems to be unsustainable? I don't know if any of you have experience with that.
I do not.
Sorry.
So there are lots of different ways that different communities have used finances to incentivize people to recycle more, but I think you have to really balance the services that you're providing as well. So certainly things like pay as you throw is an option, right? Where people have to pay either by the number of trash bags or by the size of their trash bin. And that can, help explain to people what works well, to encourage people to recycle, but you have to do that along with education and disincentives for throwing your trash in the recycling bin, because if you're not careful, people are going to try to recycle more things than really can be processed by the system. So you have to be able to have the resources to balance those kinds of incentives.
You make a good point there.
Kristyn, how does it work in Baltimore?
We don't want to disincentivize proper collection. So if you are charging per bag of trash, while that could incentivize recycling, it could also potentially lead to illegal dumping or putting things in the recycling that don't belong there. So I think it's really important to have all the resources together and a good plan of action to implement a program like that well, and make sure everybody has everything they need. In Baltimore, we actually, all of the collections are serviced out of the general fund of the city, which is mostly property taxes and all the other types of revenue streams the city gets. So there's not a separate fee, but it's definitely something that's been discussed over the years.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question in here in the chat about people being disillusioned by recycling infrastructure, and that actually plays into a question I was going to ask you all to talk about a little bit about. We struggle a lot in the United States with something we call hopeful recyclers, who throw everything into the bin that they think might or might not be recyclable, but is clean and dry. And it obviously creates major issues with contamination of the streams, and then gums up a lot of the MRF equipment. So Keysha, I was wondering if maybe you would share a little bit about what you do at the Recycling Partnership to reduce that type of contamination. And I know Kristyn has had some experience in Baltimore as well with that.
So at the partnership, we focus on what we would call anti-contamination to help combat the wish cycling. And essentially, our anti-contamination programs are geared towards providing education and direct feedback for residents at the curb. So our system essentially provides education through mailers, direct mailing to residents that will inform them of what they can and can't recycle through the method of an informational card of some sort. We also engage in additional outreach and education awareness pieces, such as some social media engagement, but we essentially try to bring attention to the recycling program and awareness. And then we leverage that information by having direct feedback at the curb, by sending staff out to essentially take a quick peek in a recycling cart. And at the curb, if there is material in the stream that residents should not have in, because we've already built this workup to inform them of what they should and shouldn't be doing, we then leave some sort of tag that tells them don't place this material in. So that feedback at the curb, essentially, it draws the attention immediately to the resident that, hey, something's wrong, right? And we hope, and we know that our resources have helped people pivot. We have a behavior change that occurs through our anti-contamination programs. So that helps, one, inform residents on what they should and should not be putting in. We also use simplified messaging for how we disseminate this information, so we're not bogging residents down with too much info. A lot of municipal programs want to tell residents a long list of what they can recycle and a long list of what they should not recycle. And we know that through basic communications, that's not effective. Residents can only remember X amount of resources at any given time. So we simplify the message to focus on only the key elements that they need to focus on, that we want them to put in. We focus on the positive stuff, and then we redirect on the elements that they're putting in that's very common that shouldn't be there. And we've seen really great success through this program in the state of Ohio. We're doing the same work in Wisconsin and across the country.
That's great. I hear a lot of people confused around me about what they should be putting in their bin. I get a lot of questions about that. So sort of the demystifying of what goes in your bin and the simplification of the messaging is super important.
Yeah, and I'll add, the Recycling Partnership has just an amazing amount of resources on its website. There are videos, pre-made social media posts. There's like an anti-contamination toolkit. So it's a lot of resources that are really helpful for municipalities. It's all free to download and use. So I think everybody can really benefit from the work they've done and the experience they've had throughout the country and seeing what works.
And as we continue to work in this area, we build out resources and we update and modify to meet the educational need of the community, and also our resources are customizable, as Kristyn said. So our partners, as you all are community partners, you're able to go in and customize all of our open source resources to better meet the messaging needs of your recycling program. And we've also introduced an anti-contamination toolkit that's centered around drop-off, because we understand that we're talking about access. Not all communities have access to curbside recycling. Their recycling is done through drop-off system. So we have an anti-contamination toolkit to address recycling through that resource as well. And it can all be accessed at our website on recyclingpartnership.org.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hey, and I'm just going to do a quick shout out for, we also need to be looking toward the future, where, you know, how can we also look at technologies that help sort things better so that the things that get to a recycling center have a higher value, the better that they're sorted, and how can we figure out to get more kinds of materials to be a part of this, you know, circular economy system
can handle
using things
whatever
like
we throw
advanced
at
recycling.
it, right?
So I really think that that is part of the future that we need to be working toward.
I also am seeing some questions about how
Bowling
do we
balls
build,
will always
reduce,
be
and
rough,
reuse
so.
advocacy into our outreach efforts. Does anybody want to address that?
So all of those are part of a sustainable future, right? So I could have a whole other panel talking about how reducing and reusing is important and what we're doing. So I think that that is important, but we need to also make sure that, you know, recycling will be a piece of the system. Reducing and reusing alone isn't going to get us there.
In
And if we want
Baltimore,
to be able to get that
last
material
November in
back
Time
and
for
keep its
America
value,
Recycles
then
Day,
it's going to
we
be really
just
important that
in-house
everybody have
developed a
access.
website where you can type in, you know, various common items, and it will tell you if it's accepted in the city's single stream recycling program or where and how you can recycle it. But we also incorporated kind of tips for reducing that waste, you know, donating it, reusing it. So like, you know, what do you do with old clothes? Well, first donate them if they're in good shape. And if not, we don't have textile recycling yet. We're looking into it, but it does not go in the recycling bin. So some tips like that, we kind of tried to push the reuse donation aspect, but then, you know, old furniture, please donate if it's in good shape. But if not, these are the drop-off centers where you can bring it to. So I think it's almost like item by item in a way. Like, yes, you can recycle this plastic water bottle, and this is how, but also consider using a reusable water bottle if it's appropriate for the situation. So thinking through things like that, like just incorporating it within the messaging of how do you reduce that waste in the first place.
And I want to jump in really quickly and say that I know that disadvantaged communities often are probably the best at reusing because they're working usually with less discretionary funds, right? And so I want to kind of tie it back to access, because what I also want to do is talk about ways that we at the partnership are looking to try to address some of those needs. And so we have recently, or we're launching a recycling inclusion fund. And I invite you all to help us build towards an equitable system that will make the recycling system more equitable across all socioeconomic platforms and regions in the US. And so our fund, essentially what we would like to do is direct grant funding to support investment in infrastructure and education. We also want to utilize that funding to support training and leadership modules, as well as research. Because I think when we're talking about access as it relates to disadvantaged communities, they often get left out of the dialogue. And the work that we're doing is also intended to provide and to address those needs, but also provide representation as well too within this particular field.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that. We actually are out of time. It's a very short panel. So, but thank you very much to all of you for joining today and for your interesting comments and all of the questions in the chat panel. We couldn't get to everything. There was a lot in there. As the world undergoes dramatic shifts due to COVID and this growing global conversation on inequity continues to rise, our is integral to solving for a truly inclusive circular economy. So thank you very much to our friends at Dow, the Recycling Partnership, and the City of Baltimore for lending their insights and experience. Together with players from across the entire business, society, and government sphere, we can build a better world for all people and the planet.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. I don't know if we got cut off already. They kept telling us we were going to get cut off, but it's not clear to me that that's
Great job moderating, Shannon.
Oh, very
Great job,
confusing. Well, thank you all. It was a really fascinating conversation.
It was. I wish it were longer, even though we've kind of gone over. But thank you. Bye, guys.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.